Yep, I'm all go. All right, let's finish out. We're in the home stretch, and there'll be a few people come in late. That's okay. Getting back to King Solomon now. And we really see Solomon, I think we can make a general case early on, even in the midst of the kind of the suspect chapter when we saw him being described with a syncretistic heart. At least we see that fullness of his heart showing up in these early stages. I guess that's the point I was trying to make. We see him, and really there's a high point here. The temple's completed, and in chapter 8 we see the Ark of the Covenant returned, brought in to the temple, and some really rich theological reflection starts to happen here. It's done correctly. We see that, nobody's accidentally touching it and dying. Solomon's going to apply his wisdom in giving the instructions and bringing it in safely. Solomon addresses and blesses the people here in chapter 8, starting in verse 12. Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in the thick cloud. I have surely built thee, O Lord, a lofty house, a place for thy dwelling forever." So he's addressing, and in verse 14, "Then the king faced about and blessed all of the assembly of Israel, while all of the assembly of Israel was standing." So this is he's starting, and then he's going to offer one of the things that we want to say about King Solomon, with regards to this part of his heart that's applied, we're going to see evidence when we get to the book of Proverbs, for example. We'll start talking about this. But King Solomon, and like King David, the songwriter, we have the book of Psalms, which is a theological deposit for the kingdom. Solomon will have the job of collecting and even writing Proverbs, short wisdom sayings, bringing them into his kingdom as an application of his wisdom. So Proverbs will be his deposit of wisdom, theological, his theological deposit, as well as, I'll argue, the book of Ecclesiastes and the book Song of Solomon. So those are going to be his contribution theologically to the kingdom, like King David. So while we pretty soon here be a little bit critical of King Solomon, we're going to see some of evidences of both with regards to his kingship. All right, we move on into this really rich, theologically rich prayer is going to focus on the Lord who keeps his covenant, verses 22, chapter 8, verses 22 through 24. Let's have Jessica over here read, please. Say Jessica 2, Jessica 1.
You can call me Jess, I guess.
Jess? Okay. Deal. No more controversy. Huh?
It is written.
It is written. Now, Jess, go ahead and read. Verse 22 through 24.
Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel and spread out his hands toward heaven. And he said, O Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like thee in heaven above or on earth beneath, who art keeping covenant and showing loving kindness to thy servants who walk before thee with all their heart, who hast kept with thy servant my father David that which thou hast promised him. Indeed, thou hast spoken with thy mouth and hast fulfilled it with thy hand as it is this day.
Good. So this is the Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20 king showing up. He's obviously knows a little bit about his Old Testament to speak this way theologically before the kingdom. Verse 33 through 36, a little bit further into his prayer of dedication. When thy people Israel are defeated before an enemy because they have sinned against thee, if they turn to thee again and confess thy name and pray and make supplication to thee in this house, now there's the function of the temple showing up, right? This is going to be a place where people come to deal with sin. That's important. Then hear thou in heaven, and forgive the sin of thy people Israel, and bring them back to the land which thou didst give their fathers. So repentance will be the centerpiece and showcase of what happens. And this is good theology. When the heavens are shut up and there's no rain because they have sinned against thee. So ongoing, God's going to get the attention of the people. The people will come and deal with sin. So one of the central places of and the name of Yahweh is on full display. Verse 41 through 44. Also concerning the foreigner who is not of thy people Israel, when he comes from a far country, for thy name's sake, for they will hear of thy great name, reputation, and thy mighty hand, and of thine outstretched arm. When he comes and prays towards this house, hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to thee, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name, to fear thee, and to do and also as do thy people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have built is called by your name. See, the emphasis of the name, the reputation of the name Yahweh. This temple that's been built, Solomon seems to understand the full implications. It's a showcase for the name of Yahweh to the watching world. So that's kind of important. And then in the benediction here near the end in verses 56 through 61, and we have I think what we have here from Solomon is just this recognition of God as king. He's ultimately the king overall. Verses 56 through 61. Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel according to all that he's promised. Not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he promised through Moses his servant. May the Lord our God be with us, as he was with our fathers. May he not leave us or forsake us, that he may incline our hearts to himself, to walk in all of his ways, to keep his commandments and his statutes and his ordinances, which he commanded our fathers. And may these words of mine with which I have made supplication before the Lord be near to the Lord our God day and night, that he may maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel, as each day requires, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God, there is no one else. Let your heart therefore be wholly devoted to the Lord our God, to walk in his statutes and to keep his commandments as it is to this day. Wow, if we just stop there, right? What a high point theologically for King Solomon. And it seems to be this one Lord, one King idea that comes from, even Moses' teaching in the Shema, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind and strength. That whole theological thread. This comes back in places like this. So I would almost look at Solomon kind of like this right now. Then we turn to 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. We have another word now coming from the Lord to Solomon. And it came about when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time. Remember the first time? And he appeared to him at Gibeon, that high place. And the Lord said, I've heard your prayer and your supplication, which you've made before me. I have consecrated this house, which you have built, by putting my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. But as for you, that's one of those buts. It says and, but as for you, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, with integrity of heart, full heart, and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and you will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I'll establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons shall indeed turn away from following me, and shall not keep my covenants, my commandments, my statutes, which I set before you, and shall go and serve other gods, right, and worship them, then I'll cut off Israel from the land which I've given them. So there's no deviation from that fork in the road. This goes all the way back to Moses' instruction. This way, obedience, a blessing, disobedience, exile, that idea. So it comes back here in this warning that the Lord gives to Solomon. All right, now, let's see here. Let's keep going here. So this is our deep thought picture for the book of 1 Kings. Here we go. I'll point over here. 1 Kings, and this is a picture of Solomon, right? And I like it because it shows the half heart. Just interesting, right there. And some of the evidence of the half heart. Where does this evidence come from? Well, we're going to look at it in the text. So it's kind of pretty accurate. We remember Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20. Moses instructs with regards to a king. What should the king do or not do? Not acquire lots of horses. That's Deuteronomy 17. Why? That's the military idea of building an army. Not acquiring many wives. That's the idea of the covenant or treaty making in the ancient world. Not acquire great gold or amassing of gold. That's the idea of putting unnecessary taxation on your people and building and amassing wealth because it's a distraction. But should do and read the Torah, write it down word by word and learn it, but also learn how to walk it, walk the talk, so to speak. Being a billboard, a covenant billboard for your kingdom is what the king should do. Now, after this visit by the Queen of Sheba in chapter 10, we'll move to chapter 10 now. What we want to do is we have another assessment of King Solomon given to us by the author. Oops. Sorry about that. Here we go. Go back to that. It'll work good. All right. I hit the wrong button here. This is like an amplification, you might say, of what we remember reading all the way back in chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Now, more of the color is filled in for us. The author starts here. And I'll start looking, let's see here. Let's look at beginning in verse 14 in chapter 10. Pardon? Oh, 1 Kings, chapter 10, verse 14. And in the back of our minds as we read this, we want to remind ourselves of the criteria that the author here, I think, knew full well, coming from Deuteronomy chapter 17, 14 through 20. So listen closely. Now the weight of gold which came in to Solomon in 1 year was, that's a bad number, 666 talents of gold. I don't make any connection there. Besides that, from the traders and the wares and the merchants and all the kings of the Arabs, King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, using 600 shekels of gold. He made 300 shields of beaten gold. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold, verse 18. You get the idea here. All of King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, verse 21. All the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None was silver. Just a little extra detail there. It was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon. But the king had at sea the ships of Tarshish with the ships of Hiram, bringing gold. Also ivory, apes, and peacocks, just for added enjoyment. You get the idea here. What's happening here with regards? He's amassing gold. All right. That's the first thing that we see, the accumulation of gold. Now we skip down to chapter 10, verse 26. Now Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities. We saw a picture of one of them with the king in Jerusalem. What's he doing there? Yeah, he's amassing an army. Right. And we know the reason why a king in Israel shouldn't be worried about building that big of an army, right? It's that the Lord wins the battles for him if the battle's fought the Lord's way. Now in chapter 11 beginning in verse 1. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, not to mention the daughter of Pharaoh I already have, but in addition to her, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidionite, and Hittite women. It's terrible. From the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, neither shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away from the Lord after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in loyalty. Not about love. Loyalty is in the ancient love in the ancient world is this idea of covenant loyalty. So, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. All right. Is that as far as I want to go on that one? Yeah. So that's the accumulation of women. And then we have this life at a glance assessment from the vantage point of the author here, would have known the full life and extent of King Solomon in saying what he's going to say now. Beginning in verse 20, verse 4 down through verse 8. So it came about when Solomon was old, see now this is from the vantage point of him living his life, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted, right there, to the Lord his God after the heart, as the heart of David. Notice the comparison of hearts in that verse 4 had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, that detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem. And for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Molech is the god referred to in Leviticus and Deuteronomy as the god that demands infant sacrifice when they have church. Thus he did all for all of his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Okay, so the author here is screaming off the page. And we see that immediately, it didn't take long, well, here near the end of his life, that the author here gives us the divine response. Verse 9, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice with warning, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you've done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, but I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out from the hand of your son. We'll get to that eventually. However, I will not tear it away all the kingdom, but I'll give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which is my city, the city I've chosen. That's the Lord speaking. So this is where we're going. And divine judgment comes swift for King Solomon. From this point on, the author is going to give us a couple different examples of the divine judgment that comes from the Lord in response to Solomon's rebellion. And it's not unlike the book of Judges. Remember, the Lord sometimes allows or raises up or allows adversaries to come in and wreak havoc for a time. You know, what we see here in the details of the text, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 14, then the Lord raised up an adversary to Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the royal line in Edom. Again in verse 23, God also raised up another adversary to him, Rezon, the son of Eliada, who had fled from his lord, Hadadnezzar, king of Zobah. So these are adversaries the Lord is raising up or allowing to rear their ugly little head against Solomon. Solomon provides, then we get into the conflict that comes about through the prophet Ahijah in chapter 11, verse 29. So in chapter 11, we have another example. It came about at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. Now Ahijah had clothed himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak, which was on him, tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces. For thus the Lord, the God of Israel, says, Behold, I'll tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. You'll have one tribe for the sake of my servant David. So we've already read that part. So this, is divine activity that the Lord has now enacting his response plan with regards to Solomon. So again, and before we end, I just want to wrap up with King Solomon. And again, we want to evaluate this scenario. I don't want to end so negatively here with regards to King Solomon. Remember, this is written to, and I'm not downplaying the details here, but the author here is obviously screaming off the page because he's writing to the audience that's in Babylon. They need to hear and be reminded of the reason why they've been and gone to exile. One bad king after another, and the corporate sins. Remember our little chart. Now we're talking about the social sin, or the implication of God brings and delivers judgment against a whole people group. Even in this case, and eventually his own people will be judged and sent to exile, driven out of the land in response to their rebellion. We have the faithful remnant within that group. That's another conversation. But this corporate judgment that comes. But Solomon is going to evaluate his own life too, I'll argue. Let's turn to the book of Ecclesiastes. And near the end of his life, we have another collection of wisdom sayings written by, I would argue, the king himself. The book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verses 2 through 9. Here's what Solomon is saying. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. It's the idea of breath. When you blow against your hand, it's like there, you feel it, and then it's gone. That's the idea behind this Hebrew word. Breath of breaths. What advantage does man have in all of his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also, the sun rises, the sun sets, and hastens to its place and rises there again, blowing toward the south, then turning toward the north. The wind continues swirling along. All the rivers flow into the sea. Everything around me seems to have its place in the ticking of time, but except for me, I've got this ongoing feeling of uneasiness as king. And he gives some of the details. Well, down to verse 9. Let's move over to verse 13. So what's their futility? What causes futility? I would argue King Solomon says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I've set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. When you read Ecclesiastes, you got to get a little emphasis behind it. You've got to be a little bit dramatic, because he's screaming off the page. And when you think of King Solomon in this context, and you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it just sings, It really speaks theologically. This is a king writing, looking back on his own life and saying, look at all the mistakes I've made. Misapplication of wisdom, the gift that God gave me. And it led to a lifetime of pursuing and pursuing and pursuing, but I didn't find, it didn't lead me to, it was this experience of futility, He goes on, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. I said to myself, come now, I'll test you with pleasure. Well, if it's not wisdom for wisdom's sake, let me just go out and seek all the pleasures of life. So enjoy yourself. And behold, it was 2, futility. I said of laughter, it's madness. And of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine, strong drink, and with my mind while my mind was guiding me wisely, and at how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there was for the sons of men to do under the heaven and for the few years of their lives. So that didn't fill my bucket. So what else did I do? Well, I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. And I planted them and all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself, put little koi, those fish, inside the pond for myself, which was to irrigate forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves, and I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. I collected for myself all kinds of silver and gold, even though silver wasn't as valuable as gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided myself singers, many concubines. I became great, increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. See? You hear Solomon screaming off the page. He's writing to his kingdom at the end of his life, looking back and saying, this is the mistake I made. Don't make this mistake. So we're not done. I mean, we go through the whole 4 through 11. it really gets to a theological head in chapter 3. The book of Ecclesiastes speaks of this kind of this ticking of the time. It's the time that passes, and you got to be careful that you're on the right path with regards to pursuits. There's a time for everything under the sun, but guess what? Verse 11 in chapter 3. God, He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from beginning to even to the end. I know there's nothing better than for them to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. So this conflict is built into the fact that we're hardwired with this sense of longing for fulfillment that can only be found in one thing. That's what the book of Ecclesiastes says. And the thesis statement is at the very end of the book. So let's turn to the very end. And chapter 12, Solomon concludes after this whole book. It's kind of dark, Chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. He says, Therefore the conclusion, when all has been heard, is this. In contrast to a lifetime of vanity and futility, and I've just got done giving you all the details of the kinds of pursuits I was after, none of them led to this. Fear God, keep His commandments. Solomon's saying, yeah, and I remember the Lord came and visited me twice and warned me about that, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or bad. See? So that's the wholehearted king showing up, I think, with Solomon. Not this syncretistic Yahweh plus something else. He's got it right, and He's given it to us. So I think that we have, Solomon showing up with his whole heart. So, all right. Well, we'll pick up with King Solomon. Actually, we won't, because he's going to die. And then we'll pick up with his son, and then the divided kingdom next week. So thanks for your attention.